Honored custos, honored opponent, ladies and gentlemen. In the preface of his influential work titled Martial Arts of Renaissance Europe, published in 2000, Sidney Anglo noted that it was something of an experimental essay. This was due to there having been very little research, at least in English, into the genre of pragmatic literature now known as fight books. Happily, the situation has changed for the better since I was perusing Anglo's book for the first time at a bookstore some 20 years ago. Still, if I had added a preface to my dissertation, I would certainly have quoted Anglo's words as I am doing now. The way I have approached the Royal Armouries manuscript 133, the subject of my dissertation, is indeed to some extent experimental, which I believe is justified by the characteristics of fight book literature, or perhaps of technical literature in general. I make the bold assumption that the present audience is familiar with at least the abstract of my work, so I will not burden you with yet another summary of my dissertation. I will give you an introduction to the genre of medieval fight books in general, and then to 133 in particular, and provide a few visually rewarding examples of the issues that I examined in my dissertation. As discussed in Chapter 2, fight books are works that describe or convey fighting technique. Technique in general is knowledge that governs practice, and fighting technique in particular is knowledge that governs the practice of fighting. The extant fight book corpus is highly heterogeneous in terms of content, form, and purpose. Fight books cover fighting with and without weapons, in and out of armor, on foot and on horseback, and cover the full range of knightly weapons. Fight books may be made up of illustrations, text, or both. The text may be poetry or prose, or both. A fight book may be an original composition or a commentary of an existing text. Few works exist in multiple copies, and there is a distinct sense of each existing fight book being something of an individual creation. This is perhaps not a surprise considering the pragmatic nature of such books, which may also be the reason why so few of them survive. In the study of medieval and early modern fight books, the upper temporal limit is usually drawn around the time of the 30 Years' War. At the turn of the 17th century, there is something of a shift into what is traditionally considered the beginning of modern fencing. Discussing literature, as we are, we could say that this point marks the beginning of the modern fencing manual. This distinction is somewhat arbitrary, but serves to delimit the historical phenomenon with satisfactory precision. Already in the 16th century, we encounter a distinct antiquarian interest in fight books. The first printed book that was published in Vienna in 1516 makes use of 15th century material, referring to the art of the ancients, contrasting with that of the time of its publication. In 1570s, Heinrich von Günterode studied 133, the ancient book, and was convinced that this qualified him to write a book on the true principles of fencing. In the same year Günterode published his work, Paulus Hector Meyer, the treasurer of Augsburg, was hanged for having embezzled city funds for years to finance his hobby of collecting arms, armor, and fight books. During his active years, he studied the fight books he had acquired with his friends and came up with various sequences of moves that could be performed from the positions shown in the images, and some entirely original content as well. The habit of making use of existing material is already present in the 15th century fight books. Individual books could be produced as souvenirs of a short-term teacher-student relationship, making use of a collection of models, as in the case of Hans Talhofer, or by collecting a number of individual techniques into a single volume, as in the case of Hans Lectio, or by organizing and commenting on existing illustrations, as I argue to be the case with Fiore dei Liberi, the earliest Italian author active around the turn of the 15th century. All these practices are somewhat distinct from the usual process of producing more or less exact copies of manuscript books. This brings me to 133, as it is called after its old object number. Dated to the early 14th century, 133 is the oldest extant fight book, and one of the two dated to the 14th century. We may assume that a significant corpus of early literature has been lost, since both 133 and the fight books produced around the turn of the 15th century make direct or indirect references to pre-existing literature. 133 is distinct from the later works composed in Germany in many respects. First of all, it is written in Latin. Secondly, the illustrations make up sequences showing the different phases of the movements. For example, here is a sequence of 3 illustrations. In the first one, both characters are shown in guard positions, the priest with a visible poncho or in a high guard, and the student, the hooded character on the right, in a low left guard. In the second illustration, the student takes the initiative by performing the movement we see here, meant to threaten the priest and protect the student against the most likely attack the priest might perform. This is called obsessio or besieging, a loan translation from the German Gesetz. The priest fails to act and gets hit by the student as we see in the third illustration. This simple sequence shows us the beginning, the middle, and the end of a complete, even if one-sided, exchange. In another sequence, the student, this time on the left side, is again depicted in the lower left guard, but the priest, this time being the obsessor or the besieger, is shown taking the initiative by performing a movement similar to the one we just saw. In the second illustration, the student responds with an identical movement, but as we see in the third illustration, he fails to defend against the priest's attack. In the last sequence of the book, Armouries takes the place of the student. In the first illustration, both characters are still in their guard positions. Armouries on the right shoulder and the priest in the low left guard we saw in the previous sequences. As before, the priest starts moving from the guard position, but ends up blocked and countered by Armouries, seen in the third and fourth illustrations. As the captions explain, via era superiore trius parata, because she was on top and first to be ready. In these three examples, we have seen a simple attack, a failed defense, and a successful defense. A more interesting example may be found in a sequence made up of 5 illustrations near the end of the book. In the first illustration, the priest is seen in a high guard, whereas the student is, again, in a low left guard. The caption indicates that the student is the obsessor, the besieger, and should beware that the one who is about to besiege performs a cut, which is why it will be dangerous for him to delay long. In the second illustration, the priest, on the contrary, besieges the student, as noted in the caption. In the third illustration, the student has defended against the priest's movement, ending up in a bind, which has been discussed several times already in the book. Here the caption simply quotes the relevant verse, ligans, ligati, contrari, sumpeti, rati, etc., reminding the reader of the previously discussed importance of following the opponent if they try to escape from the bind. The last 2 illustrations bring in some complications. In the fourth one, the point of view has switched to the other side, spoiling the nice flow between the images. This is most likely due to the sequences having been constructed using a limited set of models. This becomes apparent if we compare these images with the corresponding illustrations in the previous sequence. In the left column, Armouries performs a cut from the right over bind, but in the right column, the student performs an identical cut, but this time from being bound with the right over bind. Even though the positions seen in these 2 sets of illustrations are, for all intents and purposes, identical, the details that identify the characters serve to create 2 completely different movements. Moreover, the movement seen in the left column is fairly easy to animate on the basis of these illustrations only. The cut performed by the student in the right column, on the other hand, is a different matter, which has prompted the second hand to add the phrase per caput lucendo gladius, that is, taking the sword by his head. This missing middle phase is seen in the last illustration, which actually shows the priest's defense. In order to perform the cut from the bind seen in the third illustration, the student takes his sword above his head, as seen in the fifth illustration, and then proceeds to perform the cut as depicted in the fourth illustration. While the student is doing this, the priest has ample time to perform his own cut, as seen in the fifth image, stopping the student's move in the middle. The relatively complex nature of the student's movement has prompted a detailed explanation in the caption of the fifth illustration, and, of course, the addition of the explanatory remark in the one preceding. As I demonstrate in my dissertation, it is necessary to treat the illustrations, the captions, and the verse quoted in the captions as separate sources that have become intertwined in the present manuscript. There are internal contradictions in 133 that may be explained as being the result of it having been produced in a similar compilatory manner as seen in later literature. This is particularly obvious in the case of the verse quoted within the captions. On the first leaf, the verse is used to introduce the 7 guards, which represent the division of the army into 7 parts as follows. Septem custodies sum incipiente, numero dextrali doctoral perna sinistro, capiti da quartam da dextro latere quintam, ectori da sextam postrema sibi languat. This describes the positions of the 6 guards under the left arm, on the right shoulder, on the left shoulder, over the head, on the right side, and on the chest. The 7th guard, referred to by its German name Langport, or long point, represents the extended position of the sword, which is defined as the end position of all actions that start from the other guards. Unlike the other German terms in 133, this one is attested in later literature as well. The verse goes on to list 2 counters against the first guard. Custodia prima reginet contraria vita, contrarium primum auxil languorte secundum. I would like to emphasize that this is an actual mnemonic verse. Not only does it have independent content, but its form facilitates memorizing it. This is not the case in, for example, Fiore de Liberis verse, which usually simply describes what his images are already showing. In any case, the verse makes it clear that there are 2 contraria or counters against the first guard, auxil and languor, 2 technical terms given in German, the meaning and relationship of which I discuss in chapter 6 of the dissertation. Whatever they are supposed to mean here, it is made clear that there are 2. The book, however, includes a 3rd one, which somewhat defeats the purpose of the mnemonic verse. There are other similar examples of the captions, the illustrations, and the verse displaying properties that may be attributed to separate underlying intents. Studying a layered source such as 133 requires taking into account several things simultaneously, or looking at everything at once, totum simul. A central topic is the language, understood in the widest sense possible. Language always exists in a context without which it cannot be understood. In the case of literature, the context is the literary culture in which a work comes into existence. This is something that appears not only on the surface level of language, which I document in chapter 4, but permeates the way content is presented and how the relationship of the text and image is handled, the language of literature, so to speak. Since 133 is the earliest extant work of its kind, its generic content must be sought not only in the technical literature that precedes it, but in the fight books that follow it. This is why I found it necessary to delve into the history of the fight book genre and what I like to call generic phenomena, literary devices and communicative structures that occur in 133 and the later representatives of the genre, as discussed in chapter 6. As for the history, 133 indeed appears to represent the earliest stage of intellectual analysis of fighting technique, perhaps inspired by Giles of Rome's analysis of the technicalities of swordplay and footwork discussed in Vegetius' epitome. Interestingly enough, the only passage in which 133 discusses footwork is at odds with what Giles has to say in his De Regimine Principum. I take this as a probable case of indirect intertextuality. Further back in time, there is evidence of fighting technique being conceptualized and depicted in the ancient world, but there seems to have been very little continuity into the medieval period. Still, the earliest examples of recording the various aspects of such technical knowledge serve to illustrate some of the universal tendencies of how fighting technique is conceptualized, such as naming specific grips or depicting the key phase of a movement in a visual medium. I mentioned earlier that the compilatory method of producing fight books might result from the pragmatic nature of the subject matter. At present, I would not go as far as claiming that this is a universal tendency in technical literature, as I have not looked into the matter on a global scale. I would, however, like to present an example from a more recent literary product that resonates with my approach to the study of historical technical literature. This is an article from the September 2004 issue of the Finnish edition of the Cosmopolitan magazine. The apparent purpose of this article is to teach the reader self-defense skills, but it is hardly imaginable for the intended reader of the magazine to train fighting moves at home without expert supervision. Thus, we may assume that this article is not about disseminating these skills, but simply describes fighting technique as a form of entertainment. Many of the generic features I discuss in chapter 6 are present. Instruction is given in the second-person prescriptive voice. It is implied that the boyfriend plays the part of the opponent, so the lady character in the illustrations represents the actor, to use my own vocabulary. The illustrations form 4 sequences, numbered as 1A, 2A, 3A, and 4A, though the capital A seems to serve no discernible purpose. It may be a remnant from an early stage of production, in which an alternate response to the attack shown in, for example, 1A would have been designated as 1B. As it stands, the last two illustrations of the first sequence, confusingly labeled as 1D and 1E, are indeed given as alternative to what is shown in the illustrations 1B and 1C. More interestingly, the moves depicted are unmistakably recognizable as being derived from Wing Chun, a martial arts style originating from southern China and made popular due to its association with Bruce Lee. The captions, however, are in conflict with what the pictures appear to show. What looks like a knee kick to the groin is described as lifting up the leg and not letting the attacker get too close. The chop to the neck with the edge of the hand is supposed to be pushing the attacker away, and what is clearly a simultaneous block with the left and a punch to the face with the right against an assailant's arm with a stick is glossed as a two-handed block. The captions are far less violent than the illustrations, suggesting that at some point a decision was made to tone down the violence and consult an expert to come up with more appropriate alternate explanations for the already existing imagery. The purpose of this digression was not only to demonstrate the lasting relevance of some of the generic phenomena occurring in medieval literary depictions of fighting technique, but also to illustrate the fact that the interpretation of even a contemporary specimen from one's own cultural sphere can present problems one might not even be aware of without in-depth study of the content, the literary and linguistic form, and the material processes through which a given work has been created, something I have attempted to give due consideration to in my work. Honored opponent set by the faculty, Dr. Daniel Jaquet, I now call upon you to present your critical comments on my dissertation.
Thank you very much. I would like to start my opening statements by thanking the University of Helsinki, as well as the custos, Anneli, and the doctoral candidates as well for his work. And lastly, Joël to provide me with a sword. Mine has been left at Geneva Airport, taken by the police. It was important for me to come here with a sword for two reasons. First, because I am very jealous of this Finnish academic culture of PhD candidates receiving swords. And second, because it makes a strong link with the work that is now examined. Also, I have to mention that I am a practitioner myself of these fighting arts, so it makes three good reasons to do this. The PhD candidate Antti Ijäs presented a work of 442 pages, including a body of text of 273 pages, supported by exactly 1,000 footnotes. I guess it was intentional. There is an appendix of 138 pages, which consists of a thorough edition of his primary source, with a meticulous critical apparatus and additional 56 footnotes. The rest is 7 linear pages and 21 pages of bibliographical material properly compiled. The material presented is meeting the expectation of a doctoral thesis at the University of Helsinki and has been evaluated before presentation by 2 external experts at the field of research, namely fighting studies, and both experts deemed the work as pertinent and original and outlined its quality. Let me tell you now some behind-the-curtain stories regarding my experience reading this doctoral dissertation as starters on this opening statement. When I received the file, my first impression was the following. I thought, oh no, this researcher will write on a topic which is already known to both the specialist and the general audience, and which has already received a large and meticulous body of secondary literature by experts that do happen to know personally. The primary sources itself has already received scholarly editions and translations in French, English, German, and Italian language. So when I got the work, I said, what could it possibly have? He proved me wrong. I then considered the background of the doctoral candidates and my memories of our discussions when I met him at the conference in Germany a few years back. I then reviewed the abstract and went on a quick read of both his introduction and conclusion. I will now let you know of my impression with both sound and mimic. Oh. And I have to It is worth mentioning because it does not often happen when reading a scholarly text. The author has delivered an excellent work and was nonetheless able to insinuate some proper sense of humor while discussing very serious matters. In the own words of the candidate, his study, page 28, I quote, sets out to investigate the content of the 133 manuscript through its language and genre, end of quote. Actually, it does more than that. Providing the reader with a journal history of the specific genre of the five books, he argues that without this he could not argue and pursue his investigation, as a subgenre of technical literature or pragmatic literacy. I am a trained historian, and as any other scientist, I care a lot about the research questions of the researcher, which are the following, quote, page 10. Question 1. What is the position of 133 within the literary tradition of five books? Question 2. How was 133 composed as a work? Question 3. What is the meaning that 133 tries to convey? These three research questions are very, very much focused on textual and material evidence, as well as interpretation of its content. As we will later see in the questions, he is very thorough in his translation, so it is important. The meaning is important to him, as well as his additions. At the first glance, the historian in me was a bit disappointed in the start with these three research questions. No mention of the context of application of fighting, the target audience of the manuscript, or any other matter regarding the practice of fighting, which is a subject matter of interest of mine. But then I read the whole dissertation, and I was impressed. Impressed because of the mastery of the philological and linguistical science by the author, but especially what he managed to make out of it. An authoritative study, reference work on this first fight book of the corpus, where he also used comparative literature methods, codical investigations, and a proper autopsy of all elements of the textual evidence, combined with everything that he presented in his opening lecture, which are the different ways in which he understood the different layers of text, which is very, very important. I was also impressed because I faced similar issues in my own dissertation in 2000. I was writing in 2009. I had to conduct a case study comparing 52 manuscripts on a corpus of more than 100 without proper authoritative existing work offering an overview of this corpus. Later on, as he mentioned in his thesis, most of the so-called authoritative work, how with English with this, I'm a French native speaker, there is room for improvement, at least. So as the candidate, I had to digress from my central argument to provide a treatment of the genre of fight book. What was amazing in the work of Antti Ijäs, aside from his problematic work, was the amount of secondary literature which he had to digest now compared to what I had 15 years ago. I would like now to make a few comments, so no answers required, just a few comments, and we will go then to the questions part. My first comment is regarding the, sorry, I have the good pages. My first comment, as noted in the also external evaluation, is that there is a lot of digression in his study, sometimes leading us away from the central argument. We think that we might suggest the doctoral candidate if he envisage publication to shorten these digressions. I will just list a few of them. He goes back, as he mentioned in his opening lecture, about earlier sources, antique ones, centuries ago. He talks about Vegesius' Epitoma at page 11. He talks about Greek papyri. He talks even about the visual elements of the Ben Hassi tomb in Egypt. He then goes to a period after his primary sources, to 15th century fight books. For example, Sorgen of Lectio, I will just list them out. Some plays of Linkitzer, some elements of the so-called Lichtenauer traditions, other modern-day literary works to explain different elements for his arguments. Chinese titles for the argument of the global phenomenon. He goes into the research of terms regarding the history of fighting, military history, regarding gladiator warfare. He also makes a digression about other texts, such as the Abbé Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which are other genre, or the Maximian books in the 16th century, or the Avianus fables. All of which he defends himself to be very useful for his dissertation, I guess, and my impression was that sometimes he made discoveries there, and he was willing to include them in PhD form, but he doesn't directly serve his main argument. So as for the digressions, now I would like to outline that he sometimes failed to acknowledge his own discoveries. You should be proud of your discoveries, and this is a feature that we see in a lot of doctoral dissertation, and I had the same critique of my opponents back then. So bearing this in mind, I have listed all his own findings, which sometimes we refer properly, using the first person, I. That is not always the case. He makes a very interesting development regarding antagonistic versus agonistic activities, which is kind of new. Well, we have seen this in other researchers, but not according to Freiburg studies. Based on a study of Greek papyri that he also published as a proper article, which I had the chance to review and comment before submission. He provided notes on the reception of a few sources relevant for the history of the production of the books. He proposed a new dating of the book, of the source. He conducted an investigation that was not conducted before on the flesh and parasites of the vellum, on the proper political investigation conducted. And the body of the work is the language analysis with all elements of the language, of course, that is spelling, morphology, mistakes, syntax, sentences, as well as the interpretation of the meaning with the metrical analysis, the rhyming patterns, and everything. So that's chapter 4 and 5. And he made also two new arguments. I thought he could not make new arguments in a study of this source. He made, though. One is his hypothesis that the proper order is not Eutycherus, as suggested by Frank Sinato and discussed by Vorgang, but Alkersleiden, we will discuss this. Well, author of one of, well, there is 3 hands for those who are familiar with this, and one is definitely him. And he made the order of composition. So he studied the way, based on textual and material evidence, the book was actually written, which helped us to understand the content, which is very, very, very rare in the study of fight books and needs to be done on all sources. So thank you for this. I will end my opening statement before going to the questions by mentioning that there is a proper interest, not only in the scholarly world, but also outside. Since when he uploaded his PhD thesis on the server, 174 downloads since August 8th, which outlines that what you have produced has raised interest. And second, in his forward and thanks, I would like to outline that he is fighting for the development of an emerging field of study, which I am part of, by, for example, suggesting the National Library to buy books for other researchers to have access to proper findings, and he also managed to include martial art studies in the database for historical research in the university, at the University of Helsinki. Thank you for this. And now, if you would like, we may proceed to questions.